Welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. And today, for the first time, we're broaching the topic of AI, and I suspect it won't be the last. I have with me two distinguished guests. I'd like to welcome Mike. Welcome to the show,
Thank you.
and Gautam. Welcome.
Thank you, Mike.
Mike, you're the guest today, so maybe you could start by just giving us a quick 1 minute intro. How do you find your way into identity and Okta?
Yeah, for sure. Mike Berthold, I work as a senior solutions architect at Okta, and I've been doing identity for about 20 years now. Started in the private space for a major railroad up here in Canada, and ended up an identity and access management team lead, working mostly on IBM Tivoli Identity Manager, for those of you that remember that.
Oh, yeah.
And ended up moving to the vendor side as a pre-sales engineer at CA Technologies. And did that for about 7 years, went through the Broadcom acquisition, which was quite challenging, and ended up moving over to Okta in 2021 just because I wanted to keep working on new things in identity, because it's a constantly evolving domain. And so you definitely kind of want to stay on that leading edge. And so I work as an architect on the pre-sale side. So I get brought in whenever we have to go deeper, we have to go maybe more strategic in terms of what we're offering to our customers.
And Gautam, maybe a quick background. How do you find your way into identity?
Sure. Thanks. I started, and most of my life I have worked in the telecom space, and that was my interest from identity. One of the things, I worked with Vodafone Group for 13, 14 years. At that time, I realized one of the things that the mobile telecom has done quite nicely is actually identity, because the mobile telecom works around this humble, small hardware called SIM, and I in SIM stands for identity. It's subscriber identity module, right? So it uses cryptography and humanizes identity, which means it doesn't involve the humans that much, but still takes care of identity quite nicely. And then I moved to GSMA, the GSM Association. It's the trade organization for mobile operators, to do exactly this, identity, right? So that mobile operators' assets, including the cryptography in the SIM, and lots of other data elements and signals that they have, to what I call to help solve the identity crisis in the internet. Then some of us who are working in that. So I was the chief architect for Mobile Connect, which was the identity initiatives on behalf of all mobile operators around the world. So I was involved in deploying that Mobile Connect across 62 operators in 30 countries. Then some of us in that Mobile Connect program then founded and co-founded SecurID. And now we are utilizing the assets from the mobile operators, including the cryptography in the SIM, a lot of data, and a lot of AI and machine learning to evolve that identity journey.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. Well, so today the topic that Mike proposed was around AI. And let me share a quick slide that I think maybe might help the context. And so this is a Gartner quote. They're positing that 35% of organizations will utilize generative AI as part of their identity fabric functions by 2025, which is pretty soon. So Mike, maybe you can just start us off in this discussion. What do you see sort of as the near term and long term applications for AI on, let's say, the defensive side?
No, absolutely. It's funny because everyone's kind of talking about AI and how it can help address a lot of problems. And one of the things that it does is it really allows for what I would consider the detection to become a lot more specific for a user. When you think about things like behavioral, right? I'm going to take actually a step back, because I was kind of thinking about this. When you look at accounts and identity, they're often commingled, right? People think, oh, well, an account is an identity, and it's not. An account's almost like a key, and an identity is like a keychain, right? If you're talking about workforce, you have one keychain, then your personal one. And, you think about how those keys became the attack vector, right? If I can grab a key, then I can get in. So then we put in MFA, and MFA is about having a second key. The problem is, well, if you can grab the keychain, now you actually have both of those keys. And so when you look at how to defend against that, it's about doing things about the human who is behind that and how to help detect when they're doing something that's out of norm for them. So when you look at what AI can do for that, it can actually start modeling what a typical user journey looks like and typical access looks like, and surface those abnormal context. And okay, well, this doesn't seem like a normal use of these credentials. This doesn't seem like a normal use of this access. And so it can then help mitigate these kinds of attacks much faster. Because one of the biggest problems, during any sort of an incident is time of response. And so the quicker we can respond to those incidents, the less damage that can be done, and the better the response in general.
So, so what I'm hearing is that by collecting behavioral data, we can maybe make a model to detect fraud better.
Mm-hmm.
And then also perhaps AI from a defensive standpoint can help us react more. I mean, it certainly helps me write faster. Maybe it can also help me react faster. Gautam, any thoughts from your side on it? I know you have a lot of experience in this area too.
Yeah, so one of the very interesting thing or interesting time we are in alongside AI in identity is, if you just think previously, if you need to identify a human or an entity or a subject in the digital space, the problem that we were trying to solve is this the identity of the real user, or is it the identity which is taken over by the fraudster, right? That was our problem space. With AI, and especially this year, because in the AI space, this year will be known apparently by the year of agents, right? We talk about AI agents now. So these agents will be doing lots of stuff that we humans used to be doing in the digital space, right? Like we have seen lots of demos in the Google I/O as well, where you ask the agent, "Hey, go and book, a restaurant booking for me." So they will be representing us, right? So now in that problem space, in the identity space, we not only need to identify that this is the user and this is the identity of a fraudster, we need to identify, is this a real human as well or not? Is this an AI agent who is actually doing stuff on behalf of a human, right? And then that agent may or may not be a bad entity, because maybe it's a genuine agent which is representing me. But as we know, the fraudsters are going to utilize the exact same technology to represent what they were doing earlier, right? The fraud will get into these agents as well. So we need to identify those as well. So if the tools used by these fraudsters who are doing identity takeover are these AI agents and all sorts of models, we need to utilize the exact same tools as well and beyond. So that basically is a problem space, and and beyond as well, because it's not just the identity takeover. It's all the, let's say, new frauds which are coming in the identity space, fueled by Gen AI, especially, right? That maybe we can talk about later. So to start with, I would say that that's the space, or one of the space that we are getting into. I believe we are already there.
Yeah, maybe I should quickly show. There's another slide that Mike put together. Let me show this one, and it talks about, actually there's such a broad range of how AI potentially impacts security,
Mm-hmm.
and this talks about identifying outlier behavior, evaluating alert severity, because there's a lot of noise in the alert. So maybe AI can help us, sort through and make information out of that. More efficient administrative onboarding and offboarding, So in the governance IDM space for workforce, assist with access approval decisions. Again, that's a workforce governance thing. Help making better access review decisions. Again, workforce. Apply controls in niche environments. Um, so there's a really such a broad range. How do we not get actually buried by all of the potential applications and actually figure out what is the most effective use of my resources and attention as an enterprise IT guy trying to prioritize all of these things that sound like good ideas?
It's a great question, and there's a thread through these that Gautam mentioned, right? That one of the big advantages with AI is being able to process huge amounts of data at a more reasonable level. If you think about SIEM tools, right? It was always a needle in a haystack approach, where there's all this data, but what really matters is really difficult to identify. And previous efforts to do that have always been around, well, we're going to put these certain triggers, and when we see these triggers, then we'll surface, let's say, a notification. When you look at that list that you just read off, there's that similar need to take a lot of effort and reduce it by automating a lot of the drudgery, and then allowing the focus on the valuable. And so evaluating alert severity in the SOC, right? There's a ton of data on the identity side, and having the ability to parse through that, or having the AI parse through that, and then acting on the important pieces. The governance is a really good piece too, because if you think about governance, it's always had the challenge of, we need to ask people who are not technical and don't have the time to make decisions, and we're not giving them great data because we're limited by what the accesses are called, and potentially it could be internal names. It's not really clear. And so being able to provide that information. And so to circle back to your question, the good thing is a lot of these are in related but separate streams. And so what I would say to the people listening is, if there's something that you're doing today in your role that could be helped, let's say by having an intern, for instance. Well, maybe you don't need an intern. Maybe AI is going to be that answer to that kind of resource issue.
AI is the Uber intern. And you have any thoughts on how do we prioritize all of these like really legitimate opportunities for us to use the technology?
Yeah, and one of the thing I just want to highlight as well is to really identify the category of the problem as well, right? The slides that you were showing was the security professionals are talking about the impact of AI on identity or utilization, right? One of the things that we need to really start talking about is majority of the problem that we are talking about and we will be talking about are not really security problems. They're identity problems. And the way I differentiate that is, security problems are, when someone is breaking from the back door, right? That's not difficult to solve. We know it, right? Majority of the security apparatus, security protocols is pretty well known. And when someone is trying to break in from the back door, we have lots of protection in there. And AI probably will not be used to use the back door. It's more on the front door, right? All the, let's say, deep fakes that we see, all the, let's say, AI initiated, let's say, account takeover, like synthetic identity attacks, right? They're all front door attacks. They're identity problems. Just wanted to mention it so that we don't. Of course we need to run, but running and speed is only important when the direction is right? If you look into the wrong direction, maybe we will not be able to solve the problem. Having said that, one of the things I wanted to highlight, which is in line with what I was saying earlier, right? The industry has been using tools, right? Even in the pre-AI area. For example, if you want to detect that this is not a human user trying to use his identity credentials or let's say identifier to log in, it's a script, right? How we were protecting it using CAPTCHA, right? We have to realize that those tools are not good enough right now. I was talking about AI agents, right? AI agents will bypass CAPTCHA, not through a security backdoor. The way I'm sure probably many of the listeners have looked into the GPT story that happened last year, because GPT-4 was asked to log in to a website, right? That website needed CAPTCHA. What did GPT-4 did? No, it didn't create any, sophisticated, let's say, CAPTCHA bypass tool or some image processing. What it did was it decided on its own. It hired a TaskRabbit, human, and then said, "Can you solve this CAPTCHA for me?" So that human who was behind that TaskRabbit said, "Hey, can I ask you a question? Why can't you solve it yourself? Are you a robot?" You know what GPT-4 responded? GPT-4 said, "No, I'm not a robot. I have visual impairment. I can't see. That's why I'm asking you." So that human got emotional, right? He immediately solved it. So that we need to realize, right? All those old tools may not be kind of efficient or even sufficient anymore, right? So we need to realize that and then utilize and prioritize the tools that we are going to use in this new, I would say, problem and attack space.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting because just hearing this conversation and how we're bouncing back between sort of the AI as a potential new attack surface area and AI as an opportunity to gain efficiencies as an enterprise and present managers with less noise. Those are two vastly different applications. Um, Maybe let's focus on the fraud detection one first. Um, now, we actually had an episode maybe a week or so back on deepfakes, on how deepfakes are getting better at generating video content that looks very realistic, um, or where you might have a human actor who's actually controlling the movements of a computer. I mean, that's really fundamentally gets at identity. I think you're pretending to be somebody else, literally. And so we've seen that there are, technology vendors that are popping up to help detect some of these deep fakes. Um, and But it also seems like these things are easier said than done. Actually, behavioral biometrics is not new. We've been trying to collect behavioral biometrics and detect fraud for a while, but it has really been, as Mike said, a needle in the haystack problem, because for spam, we have a lot of spam to train on what a piece of spam looks like, but training on what a hacker's attack looks like is a lot more difficult, because there's fewer of those. We're not inundated with a stream of data to train. So focusing on the behavioral, yes, it's great that these things are getting developed, but they're also sort of a black box from me as a buyer of this technology. I can't look at your code. I just have to trust you. And so how do we get over? Yes, everyone says their AI is going to do this, but how do we know it actually works? And how do we sort through some of the hype in this?
It is a great question, and what I'll say is, when we look at kind of this war, right? And so every time there's a new technology, it's always going to be a war. And the problem we have is, as security professionals, we tend to be very, responsible. And so we're not going to adopt new technologies right out of the gate. We're going to take our time. We're going to evaluate it. But the bad actors don't have that limitation. They will absolutely adopt as soon as they can. And they're getting more and more sophisticated. And so, one of the ways to respond to this kind of problem is to ensure that you actually have your tools in place and your policies in place that will help at least mitigate. And so the deepfake is a really interesting one, because if you think about that kind of this one story about in Hong Kong, this company that somebody thought they were talking to the CFO and his team, and it really wasn't. It was actually all being deepfaked, and this person unfortunately was convinced to transfer out $25 million out of the company. so you start thinking, okay, well, it's because the attackers were able to access, the video system, or it's Zoom, Teams, what have you, and so that is typically considered a low risk access. And so maybe the password was simple MFA, but now we see that even video conferencing is potentially a high risk application. And so using something like a phishing resistant credential is maybe the first step in that, and something that we really stress here at Okta. But then when you look at ways to mitigate, we need to move away from the front door mentality a little bit, because we always kind of have that, okay, once somebody has positively authenticated, potentially with multiple authenticators, now they're in. But now, are we still following up on what they're doing with that access? And it goes back to what Gautam was talking about, that, yeah, identity is the vector. But we need to be better at having this, evaluation of a session over its lifetime. If I'm a new bank employee, and I get access to maybe the vault, it's not going to be unfettered access, and they're obviously going to be monitoring me. But sometimes, especially in IT, because the focus is always we need to provide access because we're seen as a friction point in the business, we're told, well, get the person the access and then let them work. We need to move to, and so something that Okta is doing is adopting, that standard, continuous authentication evaluation protocol. So now it's not just about letting them in the front door, but watching what's being done with that access, and always validating that the session is still secure, that the context hasn't changed. Now, all of a sudden, has the IP switched to an IP that's, out of the country? That doesn't make sense, right? So we need to be better at kind of having that, that defense in depth approach. And I think that's one of the key ways that we can help address, kind of that flowing, risk model.
Yeah, you mentioned CAPE. I just checked the schedule real quick, and I know we have Shane Miel and Mike Kaiser from CAPE coming on June 27th. So quick plug if you want to learn more about CAPE, what it does and doesn't do, June 27th. But got many thoughts on what Mike said?
Yeah, I completely agree with Mike on the critical need for continuous authentication, right? And then there are good reasons why, because it was identified and understood a while back, right? But the barrier was the explicit authentication processes, right? Because if the user needs to do something to get into the session, right? In that case, if you want to do it every few milliseconds or every few seconds or even every few minutes, right? That's not acceptable for a business, right? Because in that case, no user will accept it, because whatever is that, even if it is, let's say, Face ID, if the user needs to scan their face, look left, right, every few minutes, it's not going to work, right? So one of the critical aspect, or I would say prerequisite for continuous authentication, is seamless authentication, right? Where the user doesn't need to do much. And how do we do that? Actually, again, coming from the mobile telecoms background, and actually that's something that excited me. So, for example, if I need to make or receive a phone call, my mobile operator doesn't say, "Hey, stop. You prove first you are Gautam, then only you can take that phone call." That doesn't happen, right? Does that mean authentication is not happening? It's happening every few milliseconds, right? Continuous authentication is happening with my SIM. But because I am not involved actively, so it is feasible from business perspective, right? It's happening behind the scene. How is it happening? Using cryptographic authentication. That's something that I think the industry is realizing, that cryptographic authentication is something that's needed. And then AI will fuel that, right? Because AI will do passive authentication. So the continuous authentication needs to be preceded by passive authentication. Then only it works. Having said that, I want to add a few other things as well on the on the vector. We were talking about deepfake. Yes, deepfake there's a lot of marketing, kind of messages around. It's getting picked up because it excites the human brain, right? Oh, deepfake, and someone got conned. But there are other problems as well. Probably there is not much getting discussed, and we need to talk about it, which is, for example, the phishing landscape, right? The phishing landscape has changed significantly after the GenAI revolution, right? Previously, if we all remember, right, the phishing messages, mostly they used to come in the email, and it used to be some Nigerian prince giving us money. We all know about that, right? And you will read it, even if the let's say the message is not that Nigerian prince, but whatever message is there, you will just by reading that you will know that that's wrong, right? Because the language will be not correct or there will be spelling mistakes. But now with this GenAI model, which are freely available, the phishing messages are more and more accurate grammatically, and also there are no spelling mistakes. And it doesn't stop there because these fraudsters are training these large language models or small language models with our own content that we are publishing in our Xfeed or in our reels, or publicly we are talking about in any of the social media platform, so that the phishing messages are not just accurate grammatically and spelling wise, they're more personal. They will look like that is coming from my own contact. And again, it doesn't stop there, and that's the scary bit. I was actually talking in a conference, and there was another speaker who was a neuroscientist. What he said is, the viral contents are viral for a reason, because apparently those viral contents increase the level of dopamine and oxytocin in our brain, right? How it happens, I don't know. I'm not a neuroscientist, but apparently that's why. So these bad guys are training these large language models with this viral content so that the phishing messages are not just accurate and not just personal, they will make us emotional. And then the term that is used there is amygdala hijack. So our amygdala will be hijacked and we will perform the action that the phishing messages are expecting us to do. And that's a scary situation, right? That's the what we are entering into, maybe already have entered. We need to realize that, and any of the tools that we are using, creating, generating, needs to be protecting these attack vectors, not just the old attack vectors. Just wanted to add that, because there's not a lot talked about that yet, I would say.
I like the phishing link, because in terms of priority, phishing's like one of the biggest attacks. And so mitigating phishing, I think, is one of the highest priorities for enterprise. And yes, we have phishing resistant credentials. That helps. But I think you're raising a good point about how I've noticed the quality of my job applicant cover letters has gone way up. But you're right. I guess that also applies to phishing emails too. And the better phishing emails, of course, are the ones that are personalized. And now this attack has scales and got even better, although I'm not sure we're any better at preventing it. So, Mike, what are your thoughts about phishing? Assuming, yes, everyone could use passkeys, but before that happens, is there some way that you see AI helping with the phishing problem?
Yeah, I really like how Galton mentioned that, because it's something I often think about, that we've done a really good job of building out defenses. And again, it's always this kind of long-term war, right? And so the bad actors will look at easier methods to get to what they're trying to do. And as we've put in all of things like, basic MFA, other kind of policies, what's happened is that they've moved to the softest target. And unfortunately, that happens to be humans, right? Because we're very fallible, right? We all make mistakes. And
emotional.
And emotional, yes. And so it makes sense that that's where the pivot has gone, and phishing has become kind of that big vector, because you're basically relying on people making mistakes. And so when you think about how AI can help in that, I often think that AI can help detect when humans are making mistakes, because it's not now, oh, I need to detect that there's a bad actor trying to use this, this credential, but more, this is being used in a way that this human doesn't typically use this credential. Could there be a reason for that? And could that reason be that they're actually going through a phishing journey right now? Because you're right, phishing resistant authenticators is definitely a way to move, but what do we do today? And so having the capability to have that kind of reactive analysis at the time of login and at the early stages, it kind of goes back to that point that, if you're looking at an organizational level of security, it's really important to react very quickly and ensure there's not a long-term lag between when it starts and when you actually detect it. Similarly, for an individual's journey, if we can detect that they're being phished really early, we can greatly limit the damage that's being done to their identity.
Is this really an identity problem though? Because maybe it's an email problem. Maybe we just need to filter email better for spammy. So I'm not actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not actually sure it is an identity problem.
It is an identity problem because the vectors are going to be multifaceted. Email is the more common one, but we're seeing SMS being used more and more often, Facebook messages. Basically, any communication medium is going to be a risk vector. And so email sanitization is really important in filtering. But this could be, somebody being phished in person even. Right. And so we need to have that defense of the identity because it's really the identity that the attackers are going after. And the problem from from an industry standpoint is sometimes it'll be through, we're being very, professional and cautious, and we have our great policies and all that. But guess what? Humans, and this goes back to that keychain analogy I used before, they often use the exact same key all over the place. Right. And so the attackers are going to find the weakest link in that keychain and hopefully grab credentials that they can try to use for something that's more valuable. And we see that a lot. So it all comes down to we need to secure the identity because it really is the centerpiece now of what the attackers are trying to gain access to, because it opens the door to so many other possibilities for them.
I'm sorry, Gautam, go ahead.
Yeah. If I can just add to that, the way I think you asked the question, Mike, that, is this really an identity problem? I think it's an identity industry problem, right? It's the way we have implemented identity, because when we are asking that question or even, thinking about that, we are assuming that the human who is receiving that email or SMS or an RCS message needs to do something with either to prove her own identity by getting authenticated, hand over an OTP, or click a link, right? So that's an implementation problem, right? What if we remove the human from this identity dance altogether? I know there could be discussions on privacy, etc., but if you park that for a second, right? If let's say I receive a phishing SMS, right? That's quite big in many of the geographies right now to fish for OTPs, right? Banks send me an OTP. There will be social engineering happening. Someone will be sending me a phishing message or calling me to hand over that OTP. What if there is no OTP to hand over? What if there is no link I need to click in, right? In that case, this bad guy can phish me, can make me emotional, but I don't have anything to hand over. I don't have any secret to hand over. I don't have any link to click. In that case, me as a human is protected. So the way I see this is a humanization of identity problem, not really an identity problem. How do we solve it? Yes, there is a solution. Like Mike talked about the continuous authentication, and continuous authentication needs to happen only when there is passive authentication, where the human doesn't need to actively participate, right? That could be a solution for all these. And then AI can help immensely in there.
What's probably better technology than the AI is my dog's nose, because my dog, I don't do anything to identify myself, and I walk into the room, and my dog knows 100% of the time it's me, and that's a great user experience for me. I don't have to authenticate to my dog. So the phone, I think it's so tempting to say, well, we carry this thing around. But then I think that, and I don't want to get too distracted in this, but how do I know that it's me holding the phone and not my son? So the phone itself can't be the only indicator of identity. I think AI does present an opportunity for us to gather data from the phone to create a biometric profile, behavioral profile based on data that's coming from the phone.
Mhm.
However, I can't figure out what that data is. And then you have to balance the privacy implications of collecting that behavioral data. For example, it would be very interesting to know the app history. I bet you I have a very specific profile of what apps I look for. However, leaking my app history to my company so they can do a behavioral biometric check might be a privacy problem for me. And so the more obvious data that's not privacy um, 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 degrading is also maybe not that useful. Like gyro data is great, but gyro data is also too noisy to actually make a profile. So Gautam, I guess I'll throw this question back to you. If we're using a mobile device, how do we actually know it's the person?
That's brilliant question, Mike, and you already hinted towards a solution. It sounds like, right? So, when I am holding these mobile devices are almost supercomputers these days, right? Most of these devices contain at least 14 sensors, not just gyroscope. So it's gyroscope, accelerometer, magnetometer, altimeter, and so on, right? So the way I hold this, there is a micro vibration in there. In the XYZ axis, there is a specific coordinate in there. There's a specific height. There's a specific magnetic field strength in. You can actually use, even if it is continuous data and it's too noisy, okay, not one single, let's say, sensor data, not just gyroscope, right? It needs to be plural. It needs to be the gyroscope data, it needs to be the altimeter, it needs to be the accelerometer. If we train a machine learning model with that, it can uniquely identify this. And this is something that we are doing actually in Sakura, right? We have a machine learning model that actually gets 5 sensor data. All these 5 sensor data are basically beyond the privacy boundary. You don't really need to give permission because they are not uniquely identifying you. You can train a machine learning model which then uniquely it doesn't identify that this is Mike or me, right? But it identifies it's the same human holding the phone who was holding whenever the
Yeah.
previous interaction was happening.
So I'm curious, Mike, if you have any thoughts about the privacy implications. I could just imagine like a government saying, oh, yeah, we're going to have this app and you're going to carry it around and it's going to collect all this biographical data. What's the implication of that in maybe a murder trial? Maybe I happen to be near a murder that occurs that I wasn't involved in, but now I'm having trouble disputing the data because. So I'm just wondering, Mike, if AI can help us here, what are maybe some of the challenges in privacy that we might see as a result?
It is a great question. I did want to first kind of mention that we also have at Okta have this methodology of trying to leverage, the end user device as a phishing resistant authenticator, leveraging the fact that there's a secure enclave. I mean, biometrics was something that and this is why it kind of relates to what you're asking. I remember 20 years ago, we knew that biometrics was maybe the next step in kind of trying to get away from passwords and move towards passwordless. The problem was, it was always, well, where are we going to store the biometrics, right? And there's all this personal information, and how are we going to protect it, and who's going to be responsible for it, and who's going to willingly turn that over? And then all of a sudden, about 10, 12 years ago, the phone manufacturers gave us that answer. Well, you don't actually have to transmit the biometrics out of the device, right? There's a secure enclave. It's there. It's encrypted, etc. And so, if you look at kind of going towards the future, I think it's going to have to be something like that. If it's going to be anything that's really personally identifiable, local encrypted storage that, is protected is probably the way to go for a lot of that. But yeah, and even the stuff that we offer, it's always going to be, it's not going to be one size fits all, because it's going to depend on the workforce side. There's an easier mechanism to say, okay, you do need to have this app, for instance, and so you should have this so we can authenticate you. But even there's workforces that are bound by union agreements, for instance, and so maybe we can't, and so we have to find alternate methods. And so, yeah, AI can help in the sense of, maybe having the ability to have that analysis locally so that it doesn't kind of go up to the cloud. And then, once it's in the cloud, then, is somebody going to be asking for it, right? The government's a good example. But it's still kind of fuzzy how we can do that in the future with his stuff like what Gautam's talking about, which is kind of really that leading edge, analysis of a lot of different signals, which individually may not be PII. But I know that there's legislation being written now that, even if individually it's not PII, if the combination is personally identifiable, that may fall under the legislation, right? So there's a lot to navigate there.
Yeah, the AI is better at correlating all this disparate information and maybe figuring out some way to correlate you. So we talked about deep fakes. We talked about, I guess, behavioral biometrics. Maybe we'll circle back and talk about continuous authentication. Mike, you mentioned you worked with SiteMinder and Tivoli, and those tools, you'll remember, they weren't just identity tools. I work with those tools too. We always said identity and access management.
Yep.
So the idea that there's some type of central authorization engine is not really new to the industry. We've been doing this for a long time. I think what's new is that we want to more frequently query this authorization point instead of just that access to application as the main. But I think that so if it's not new, it's not like we couldn't do this in the past or we didn't think about it.
Right.
And with regard to CAPE, I will say that people project all sorts of life, the universe, and everything on CAPE. CAPE is actually a way for disparate domains to communicate account takeover. It's not an answer to continuous authentication. But how do we, how would we even connect this AI information into our continuous authentication? And what are some of the barriers in the application developers? Because as I said, it's not like this is new. They're not doing this. We'd have to ask developers to change their behavior. What are some of the challenges in that area?
No, it's a great question. And I love the point that you're right. We've had the capability to even do continuous authentication in a certain form with, let's say, SiteMinder, for instance. The challenge was it was always kind of a very static, policy-driven approach, where if you're accessing this resource, all right, now, what level of authentication do you have? Do we need to go higher? Do we want to, go through the auth pipeline again? What I think AI brings to the table is twofold. One is it becomes not static. Now it's dynamic. And so depending on conditions and changes that maybe you don't even have to write specific policies for, it becomes more of a, okay, well, the risk score in general is moving up as we kind of go through that, or as a user goes through their session, maybe we start going through a pipeline more often in a silent method, right? So that we're not causing friction to the user, but we're just, checking conditions. From the app developer point of view, AI can definitely help because we talk at Okta about Gen AI being able to create policies, for instance, or at least suggest policies. But similarly for developers, it can help build code and build it faster and build those integrations so that they can call out. Because you're absolutely right, it's going to be a unified effort between us as the identity professionals and our developer friends to ensure that we actually have that, user flow.
I'm starting to wonder if I should have raised that huge topic right at the end of our show. Wait, let me change this real quick. Debunking. So next week we have a really great episode with Tim Capelli from Okta now, another Okta person, about debunking misconceptions about passkeys. And there are many of them. People also project life, the universe, and everything on passkeys. And I know we have Tim and Matt Miller from Cisco are going to talk about this. So I'm really looking forward to and grateful for them for coming on. And so I guess before we break, Gautam, last thoughts before we break? I don't think we solved it all, but any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think we need to keep talking about continuous authentication, and there are solutions available right now. As I said, mobile telecom has been doing continuous authentication since 1991, right? Using cryptographic authentication, where the cryptographic challenge goes to the SIM constantly, every few milliseconds, right? So basically, we need to utilize the tools to kind of to handle the new threat vectors as well. So cryptographic authentication, for example, the SIM, all the, let's say, temporal data elements, not static data. Temporal data becomes very, very important. And also machine learning model, which passively generates like this risk score that Mike you mentioned, right? So that passively it can actually identify the real user from anyone else. I think that's what we need to see more and more going forward.
And check out Sakura ID.
Absolutely. That's what we are doing day in and out.
Mike, I'll give you the last words. Mike Berthel from Okta, thank you so much for joining us. Last words?
Thanks, Mike. I think I'll maybe add a little bit more to one of the questions you asked really early. How do you kind of prioritize what you're going to do, right? Because there's so many possibilities. And, it's funny because it seems like an evergreen problem identity, how to boil the ocean, because everything we do touches so many things. And so if you haven't already started crafting your AI strategy as an identity, professional or within your organization and as a whole, now is the time to start. It's probably time to start earlier, but definitely now, if you haven't, it's time to start evaluating and identifying, especially the low-hanging fruit, the things that you'll get you the most gain with the least effort. So that would be my advice to everybody watching today. And Mike and Gautam, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to both of you.
Emir, thank you very much, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Gautam and Mike, for joining us. Next episode, Tuesday, again, debunking misconceptions about passkeys, Tim Capelli, Matt Miller. That should be a really great episode. And thanks to our guests and thanks to our audience, and we'll catch you next time.